So I'm just gonna mute their little frame there for a second. But yeah, I got a whole group of folks. Some faces, well, one face you've seen before, and a couple of a whole bunch of new folks. So I'm just gonna kind of make the rounds and make some introductions kind of as we go. And we're gonna start with the top right corner. We're gonna talk to Lex. So welcome Lex to the stream. Lex joined the team at the Turing School of Software and Design while I was there as an instructor. We never really got to work together very much or interface very much. We kind of like said hi in passing on a couple of Zoom calls here and there. But at Turing, Lex helps people and alumni like transition into jobs in the tech industry. You're also involved in a group called Kingmakers, dealing with recruitment and training plans. Tell us a little bit about Kingmakers and other things that you got going on, because you also do some live streaming on Twitch. So tell us a little bit about that, Lex.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kingmakers is a board game company based out of Columbus, Ohio, and I get the privilege and the honor of teaching a random group of people once a month how to play board games. So it's part of what I do at Kingmakers, and I also assist with training and development with them. So I also get to hire some nerds to play board games with other people. It's a very cool gig, and I'm very excited to get to do it alongside my job at Turing. And outside of that, I also stream on Twitch. I'm at Lex Survive. It's a fun play on words. But I mostly play like horror action games.
Awesome. Thanks, Lex. Appreciate that. Next, we have Martin McGovern. So Martin's been on the stream before. Martin, it's great to have you back. Let me go back to that other browser window. There we go. So we've had Martin on the stream. Martin's a career coach. He runs a company called Career Therapy, helping people transition into or between jobs. He's got a great podcast you need to check out, posts lots of videos on LinkedIn and so on. Awesome to have you back. What else you got going on these days, Martin?
Thanks for having me back. Yeah, just really digging into different podcast guests. Really excited to have someone on in a couple weeks who encourages people to basically lie to their employers and work two remote jobs at the same time. So got some interesting things coming
Risky.
up.
Risky.
Definitely check it out. He's going to be keeping
Who's
himself
on the
anonymous
podcast tomorrow, Martin?
Yeah, he'll be anonymous with like a voice changer and stuff. It'll be a
Right.
new arena for us, but a lot of really cool stuff, and just every day working with different schools and different clients all over the world, make career transitions and keep their mental health in check.
Sweet. Well, it's great to have you, Martin. Welcome back. Next up, we've got Brett Dangerfield. Danger is his part of his last name, not his middle name. Brett and I, you've been in engineering management for quite a while, like the last decade at least.
Yeah.
So part of what I want to pick your brain on tonight is like, what are some really cool questions that you've heard as an engineering manager? Brett and I met through a local Python meetup in Boulder, Colorado, and you're currently the senior vice president of engineering at SignPost. And SignPost is a company that kind of helps companies like engage better with their customers. Is that right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we help small businesses, a lot of local services and home services. So roofers, plumbers, electricians. We're a platform to help them grow their business and specifically build their online reputation, drive positive reviews onto sites like Google and Yelp and Facebook places, and then re-engage with those customers, help them use tools like Home Advisor and Service Pro to get their leads and bring when you're a small business owner, there's dozens of tools that you can use, and most of them use a lot of them, and it's really hard for a small business owner when they're on a roof on their day and they still want to get their next business. They have to bounce between like 20 different messenger platforms. We try to solve that problem to unify to a single inbox.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Well, cool. Welcome. Appreciate your time tonight on the stream. Last but not least, Emmanuel Mwangi. Emmanuel and I work together at SendGrid. I've told this story on the stream I think before, but one of my favorite interview scenarios was Emmanuel asking a question of me during my interview at SendGrid that you're not allowed to ask at an interview. We've talked about that on the stream in the past of like, what aren't they allowed to ask? And yes. I was doing the tech interview with Emmanuel and Jose Lopez, one of the founders at SendGrid, and Emmanuel like got through all the technical questions, and I guess I did okay. They hired me, and Emmanuel kind of sits back and he goes, but the real question is, are you a lager guy or an ale guy? And Jose is like, you can't ask that question. He's like freaking out in the interview. One of my favorite things ever. Emmanuel's gone on to work at really cool companies like Intuit and Hulu. You've been in tech now about 18 years as well. You're currently a back-end release manager at Tinder. Tell us what you got going on.
Yeah. I'm a back-end release at Tinder. We are hiring at almost all the positions. We're growing a lot, but we're hiring specifically for an SDET on my team, and it's we're looking for the right candidate, and we're digging deep into all the corners of LinkedIn and the internet, and so we're happy to find someone who's like great and technical, but I'm happy to be here, and it's great to reconnect here with Ian
Yeah, for
after all
sure.
these years. And
Yeah.
it's been a wild ride through all these different startups.
Yep.
Tried my hand at a couple of them myself, so it's like, there's stories there. So,
Yep,
but
for
I'm
sure.
I'm happy to be a part.
Great. Emmanuel is the serial entrepreneur for sure. Lots of stuff going on. Cool. Let's get the whole topic rolling here. I'm gonna start with Lex. Lex, as part of the career coaching that you do at Turing, obviously you help students understand like this is how to get through a tech interview and so on. When we start talking about like, hey, you should do company research and you should be aware of like things to ask them, what do you consider like good questions to sort of prompt them, or like what sorts of like topics or categories do you kind of provide to students or coach them about like you should ask these kinds of questions? Like what do you feel is an important thing for them to ask during an interview when it gets to like, hey, do you have questions for me? Like what kinds of things do you coach about with that?
That's a good question. Um, I honestly think when I have these conversations, the first question I ask people is, okay, well, what do you really want to know in the interview? Because most times people have like the three questions in their back pocket at the end of the interview, like, tell me about your company culture. Like, what is your supervision style like? And you might kind of want to know those questions, but all of the other interviewees are going to ask those as well. And they're not memorable, they're not unique. So I often ask people, like, what is it that you really want to know from people? Don't ask any of the questions off of Indeed's 39 best questions to ask at the end of the interview, because those tend to be pretty general. A lot of the folks that come to Turing are career transitioners. So they've had some kind of experience in another industry. A lot of folks have had negative experiences in other industries, which might have encouraged them to come into software dev. I ask them to like tap into those experiences and ask, internally, what are some red flags for you that you can look for, and phrase a question around that. So looking at things that you don't want to see in your next work environment, how can you phrase or ask a question at the end of the interview that can like give you some clues about what this company is like?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Martin, as a career coach yourself, any thoughts, any follow-up? Like, how do you coach people through this kind of topic as well?
I find it to be really interesting because similarly, yeah, everyone asks those like generic questions. And one of the things about interviews that is so funny is that you've got interviewers who are untrained reading from the list of interview questions from the internet. And you've got a bunch of people answering questions and asking questions that they pulled from the internet. So it's like the internet's
Fair.
just talking to itself. So I try and just I always try and like dig into the question behind the question. Like, what are people inferring from your answers? What can you infer from their questions? And what will they like when we ask a question? We're not just asking a question. We're showing what our value system is. So if my question is, what are the vacation days? Will you give me a mentor? And when will I get paid? It shows what your value system is. But if you say, how will I be measured? How will my performance be measured in this role? What are the 30, 60, 90-day expectations? What are the attributes you're looking for in someone in this role? Or something like, what has someone who was in this role before me done that really set them apart? It shows that you care about performance, and it shows that you value bringing value. So I tend to push people towards those like performance-based questions because it's really like you're not going to get any good information. Like, what's the culture like? It's amazing. Do you like working here? I do, because they're paying me right now. Like,
Right.
you're not going to get honesty in an interview in that way. So you might as well just like continue to sort of signal the things that you care about and that they want you to care about at the end of the day.
That's good. good. Appreciate that. Brett and Emmanuel, as managers, I'm sure you've sat through interviews where people have asked pretty memorable questions. What kinds of, so like, hearing, what Lex and Martin kind of coach people to ask at these interviews. Any thoughts? Let's start with Brett. Any thoughts on like, what kinds of questions really stand out to you when you get to that point of the interview? And then we'll go on to Emmanuel.
Yeah, I agree that if usually it floors me if it's a question that I haven't heard before. I love those questions. I don't care if it catches me off guard and I have to go and think about it. I just don't have a blanket response. I love when I find those questions. It's
Great.
so interesting. But I really value the questions that are you interviewing me and our company as much as I'm interviewing you. I want to know if I'm a good fit for you and how I can make a culture and a team and environment that you want to work for as well. Whether it works out or not, those are the questions that really make a difference. Like even if you think this might be your junior and it's your dream job, and I always wanted to be a software engineer, validate that it's your dream job with this company. Maybe you always wanted to work for Google. Go ask those things about what you perceive Google to be and validate that they're true. I think those are great questions. I want to know. I want to be able to sell my company and be excited to talk about my company as much as just like tell me I read this on your website. So I really like those questions. The other ones I like are questions about the people in the interview. A lot of times you will get your schedule in advance and you'll get names. When you hit up the LinkedIn, I don't like talking about myself, but I always like when someone asks me about, hey, I saw you worked here. What was the experience like? Or a peer of mine that might be in the interview that, hey, I saw you joined here and you wrote about this in your blog, or I saw this on Twitter. Like that type of research for everyone that kind of does the company research, but the interviewer research always really stands out as well.
Yeah, I actually had that happen one time at SendGrid. I got to that point of the interview and I'm like, do you have any questions for me? And they're like, yeah, I kind of looked through your job history and like every job you're like year and a half, but you've been at SendGrid for like 3 years now. Like what keeps you here? I'm like,
yeah,
whoa, weird, creepy, awesome, like, and so yeah, I'm kind of the same. Like nothing's gonna make you more memorable than like what Brett said. Like if you stump me with a question or you like hit me with something that I'm not expecting, because honestly, I'm probably expecting that top 50 list of like, go ask these generic questions that everybody else is going to ask me. And, I've got canned answers for a lot of those kinds of things. But you ask something that's like really unique and memorable, and you're going to stand out to them for sure. Emmanuel, what comes to your mind with questions like that?
I would just have to say, like, the key, I think, is like always remembering that it's two people talking, right? Like how other people on the panel have said, it's like you don't want to reduce to the internet asking each other internet questions, right? Like you want to, as a manager, whenever someone comes up with a question that I haven't heard before, like other people have said, but really one thing that I've literally experienced this very recently, where a lot of the times it's about signaling, right? And when there's certain things that you the questions that you ask want to signal your personality in a bit. It's not about just technical things, or it's not about just career oriented things. It's also in the sort of subtext of like, is this person showing themselves here? Are they still very like scared, right? And so by the end of the interview, right, it's okay to have nerves, and when you're interviewing, you always take that into account. But hopefully by the end of like a interview process, the person has relaxed enough to like show themselves a little bit, a bit of their personality. Um, maybe it's something as simple as cracking a joke. Maybe it's something as like kind of remarking on how the day has gone, remarking on how like anything that you might have picked up about the way that the people interact with each other, or the way that like, you know, how, so the kinds of questions that I would ask are like, the ones that I really appreciate is like, what does success look like in this role over the next year? Like, what would and I always love the people that ask the questions like, what would you ask if you were here, or what don't I know so far? Like, what hasn't been said? What can't really be said? So like, you know, I think I've always found a lot of value out of when I was in the interviewing seat, or the interviewee, is the like understanding the politics of like why this role is open, what the greater organization is trying to accomplish with this role, and especially when for a lot of my career has been very specialized roles in release managers or QA specialization, or being that weird role in startups that doesn't really have much of a title, or like just jumping in and figuring out a bunch of things and solving a bunch of problems. And I find myself gravitating towards that, and you know, my history shows that. And so figuring out like not just the job title, but what are they trying to accomplish is, I find that when people ask that question, it sort of signals, one, insight beyond just the technical, and two, a sort of interest in like the bigger organizational things. And as managers, we're always trying to hire people that are more aware and don't need as much hand holding when it comes to the ins and outs of the company, or what the bigger goals are for the organization.
Awesome. Thanks, Emmanuel. Lex and Martin, kind of back to you as like the career coach side of things. When you talk to people about like you should have questions to ask, how many questions do you typically tell them like you should have a certain quantity of questions prepared, or you know, plan for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes worth of discussion, you know, towards the end, or things like that? Like what kinds of things do you typically coach there? Let's start with Martin and then go to Lex. We can't hear you, Martin.
Tried to mute to be
There we go.
polite, and there I go. All right. So I always say to have, you know, anywhere between 3 and 5 questions ready to go. And I encourage everyone to have like a notepad with them, either in person or when you're doing it online, with the, you know, the title of the job, so you don't forget it, the person you're talking to, so you don't forget them, the, you know, their title and everything, notes that you like, stories, like little like bullets of stories you want to remember. And then like throughout the interview, write down questions. Because like if you only have 3 questions and they get answered during the interview, you're going to get to the end and you're like, I don't know what to ask, right? So have like 5 questions, maybe even more. Just generic stuff that you could just fill the space if you really blank and don't know what to say. But the real like skill is to come up with questions that are based on things you talked about in the interview. And then in the end, when you do ask your questions, to ask follow-ups to those questions. So like you might only have 3 questions written down, but each question could potentially have like 2 or 3 follow-ups to it. So that's what I try to encourage people to do. But at the very least, like have 10 generic things that you can just fill the space, so you don't be that person that's just like, I got nothing. And then it's just super awkward. And it ends
you don't want to
weird
be that
note.
person for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lex, any follow-up thoughts?
Yeah, a huge +1 to everything that Martin has said. I think the other piece that I am kind of hearing, even as Martin was talking, is like active listening is a skill. And I think when we think about interviews, we don't always like think of listening as part of that. It's just like you talk, I talk, you talk, I talk. But in actuality, like active listening and understanding what people are saying is a crucial part of practicing for interviews. And so you can pick up those things that you can jot down for later while you're practicing active listening.
Yeah, great. I've said on the stream before, like an interview should be conversation, not interrogation. That's one thing that I'm like a big fan. Like it's got to be a back and forth kind of thing. If it's just I ask you a question, you answer it, and then it kind of doesn't go anywhere from there. Like, I also like to really branch off and like, okay, well, based on that answer you gave me, I'm going to continue to ask you about this kind of thing. And so I go off script all the time, which, tends to, make my interviews go over time if I'm interviewing. But I think that those are some of the best kinds of interviews. Emmanuel, like what's sort of the most memorable kind of conversational interview that you had where it was like that sort of back and forth, like you're asking questions and as you answer it, you ask a question back. Like, does anything sort of spring to mind over your career that where that happened, or were you that person where you made that happen in an interview?
Um, I have a bunch where I was the interviewee where that happened. Probably one of the deepest and most insightful conversations I've ever had of this type was, and I won't name the company, but I was interviewing at this company, and this company had previously had a huge amount of scandal in like 2 or 3 years back, where a bunch of senior management left, and there was accusations of sexism, racism, all. It was terrible, and they basically cleaned house out of the top management, and so when I got to the last like culture part of the interview with the most senior manager, I was like, okay, so tell me about how. So, why didn't you like? Tell me about that process. Like, how did you guys recover from this? What did you guys do to deal with it? And I made it clear that I'm not trying to just interrogate them about this, but like what steps did you take? But like, how was that process? I asked a couple of different people throughout the day about this, and I asked one of the interviewers was a woman, and I was like, how did you feel when you saw this, and what did you do about it? And then finally, so we had this really interesting conversation about responsibility and how his wife kind of wanted him to leave, but he felt he wanted to stay because he felt like he could be the change that could make things different. But he took full responsibility. He said, like, look, it was on my watch. There were things that I saw that like I should have said something at the time, but I didn't, and that's on me, and I have to deal with that. And like that point, like made me really want to become part of his organization, because it so signaled to me that he was like going to be a responsible leader. And you want to work for organizations like that where people are taking accountability, and he didn't shy away from how bad it was, and he didn't shy away from like, just because we got rid of these people doesn't mean that the culture is gone. So we still have to be vigilant about making sure that we continue to fix things. It's not, you can't just fix things in one day. Things like this don't just get fixed that way. And so that really impressed me. But asking them about the tough times, I think, is really good. Asking about if it's a startup, how have they? Because the thing about a startup is that your worst day is right next to your best day, and asking. You don't remember how well you were doing when everything was going well. You always remember how well things were when things were bad, when we were about to shut the doors, when we were like on our last penny. And there was times like that at SendGrid too. So it's like, so asking them about that I find is also really good. And and it's a harder question as a manager to answer, things that are tough, but I think it's fair, and I respect the person for asking them if they ask that about me and the organization that we're a part of, because we're asking them very tough questions. We're asking them like,
Sure.
we ask them all the time, like, oh, how do you deal with this bad situation? What do you do? Like, what were you not proud of, right? Or something like that. And that's a standard question for an interviewee, but like, it's good when you turn it back on the interviewer and say like, okay, what do you think your organization is not doing well, and like how are you guys trying to change that?
Yeah, it's good. Brett, from another engineering manager perspective, what kinds of questions do you like candidates to ask you about, like the day-to-day job or what the team is like, or things around those lines. Like what sorts of questions do you appreciate more than like the generic, tell me what it's going to be like day to day, but like, do they ask about like, do you have strong personalities on the team, or how do you, how does your team, communicate, or pick up their work, things like that. Like what sorts of things sort of stand out to you as an engineering manager for those kinds of questions?
Yeah, I think the first setter, Martin hit on them around what's 30, 60, 90 days look like? How am I going to be evaluated? The question about is an excellent question about tell me a candidate that, or about an employee that really did a great job in this role. Those are always excellent questions because they can give you really specific answers. I love talking about the positive influences that other people have made. The other set of questions that I think are always interesting are the ones about philosophy. So everyone has different perspectives on agile, or some of us are like Scrum by the book, and some of us are like, no, Scrum's a general direction, right? Some are like, I need a Scrum Master. Some are like, no, we really don't need a Scrum Master. Like, we wing it. Like all of those ones that get into philosophy around, how does this team run, and how does this team operate, and why does it operate in that manner? A lot of times, and if you've got a good manager in there that's used to, they always are willing to get on their soapbox and preach why they love Kanban over Scrum, or how to properly do a cloud migration from a data center, or there's usually strongly held opinions, and we always love to give them. So
strong opinions in tech? Say it isn't so, Brett.
So getting those out of people in the interview are always great. And I think you can ask that bluntly, like what are your strongly held beliefs about tech? Just those are great questions to get us to, like, I love
Vim versus Emacs.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you about how the book Accelerate has really changed how I think about high-performing engineering organizations, like any of that type of stuff. So,
yeah, that's great. Martin and Lex, when you do coaching with folks, do you do like mock interviewing where you say like, hey, I want you to come up with a couple of questions? Did anything kind of stand out where you're like, ooh, don't ask them that question? Anything sort of come to mind with those? I mean, there's got to be some bad examples of things not to ask. Let's start with Martin and go to Lex.
Sure, tons. Almost no one knows how to ask questions at the end of an interview, and I think
why is that? Do you think?
I think it's like we go into the interview with this idea of I need to say all the right things. And I need to have it like perfectly stated, and everyone has imposter syndrome. And I've talked about imposter syndrome before as not so much as like I'm an imposter, like in my core, but I'm going to be caught as an imposter. So it's like this whole trying not to get caught. That's what people are trying to do in the interview. They're trying not to get caught. So they ask a lot of safe questions. They give a lot of high level answers. You say, what are your strengths and weaknesses? And they go, my strengths are that I'm strong, and my weakness is that I'm weak. And it like says nothing, right? So people say a lot of nothing in interviews because they don't want to say anything specific, because if they say something specific, they might be wrong. It's like, if I meet someone and they say, what's my name? I'm going to be like, because I don't want to get it wrong. I'm going to freeze up, right? And so I think people are so scared of asking the wrong questions that they just ask dud questions. And there's a lot of stuff on the internet about like, stand up for yourself, be a boss, like do all these things. And it's like,
easier said than done.
It's easier said than done. It's also putting you in an antagonist role against the employer when this should be a conversation. It's like, already I'm treating this employer like someone who's attacking me. And I'm like, what will I get paid? When will I get paid? Will you give me vacation? Like all these questions that mean nothing. So I just think like, what people lose sight of is this idea that it's less about getting everything perfect, and it's more about like responding well when things go wrong or when things get off track. Like I ramble, so people would just say, well, learn to stop rambling. I'm not, that's never going to happen for me. I'm going to ramble until I die. So my thing is I have to get better at getting back on track, not stopping rambling. Or like people say, stop saying like and don't, you're going to drive yourself insane. Just get better at like being more engaging so people don't care about the likes and ums or whatever it might be, right? We spend so much time trying to not do things in the interview that we lose sight of what we should be doing, which is being curious and being interested. If we're curious and interested in asking questions throughout the interview, but especially at the end, then they will be like, wow, this person cares. And that's really what they're going for. Trust, rapport, the idea that you care, the idea that they can like have confidence that you have confidence. So I think most people don't have confidence. So then they try to fake confidence and then they just quote things from the internet. And that's where it all goes wrong. But generally speaking, at the end of an interview, when you ask questions about culture, when you ask questions about whether or not they like working here, when you ask questions about like management or will I get a mentor or will you pay for my education, all these questions are, yeah, they're certainly things that you might want to know, but it's also like time and place. A lot of these questions are for the negotiation,
time
or
to
a
ask
lot
them,
of these questions are for your manager, right? When you have the job, then you negotiate all these things, right? Someone asked me recently, when do I tell them I have ADHD? And I go,
Never.
never. Or like maybe in a personal conversation with your manager once you've built their trust, like
Right.
that's a you thing, right? And so, yeah, I think a lot of the messages online right now are telling people to just like put it all out there or just read the script, and it's something in between.
Yeah, that's good. Lex, any follow-up? Any thoughts on kind of all the conversation last couple of minutes?
Yeah. So when you mentioned the ADHD piece, it makes me think of a lot of student conversations I have where folks that really want to excel and they're like excited about the company feel like they have to have this level of transparency in the interview that you don't actually have to have. You do not have to disclose your anxiety. You do not have to disclose your depression. Like if those are things, if you're asking for accommodations, we can maybe navigate that. But outside of that, those are not necessarily things that you have to be transparent about. So I have that come up a lot. And I think oftentimes when I work with folks, they either approach the end of the interview or the interview itself with this us versus them mentality of like, it's me versus the employer and I have to win this, or it is the very much the playing it safe. So you're asking like very mediocre questions that don't really get anything done and don't make you stand out, because the hard part is I think it's difficult for people to advocate for themselves when they're job searching. I often say that the job search is like an anxiety and a depression factory, and both of those things make it very hard to get out of imposter syndrome and to get out of your head sometimes. So just remembering to advocate for yourself is the biggest thing you can keep in mind when asking interview questions.
Yeah.
Can I add one more thing there?
Yeah, totally.
The worst question you can ask at the end of an interview, now I just remembered what it is what could I do better in future interviews?
Oh yeah.
And so it's like, or what, the way someone I talked to years ago said, what did I do wrong in the interview today? Because they had just been turned down so many times. They weren't thinking about this interview turning into a job. They were like, I need feedback. I don't think you'll ever get good feedback from an interviewer. They're going to just say, we went with someone with more experience. They're not going to give you real tangible advice because there's legal issues that come along with that. So when you say, what can I do better in the next interview? It's already kind of like showing your cards that you don't think you're going to get this job for some reason. And you might have had a great 30 minutes with the person. And now you're saying, before we leave, can you think of all the bad things about me? Like imagine going on a date and like the last thing you say is like, what did I screw up on this date? And they're like, well, I was having a good time, but let me think now. It's like,
well, that's the first thing on my list is asking me that question. No, I agree. And I've, go ahead.
I think that's so close to a great question. And I learned this through a mentor. I was in that situation too, where a couple jobs I really were excited about, I didn't get. And one, I had a firm helping me and their fee, I did get feedback because it is really rare. And it's like, that's not me at all. So a mentor of mine told me, to use this trick. And I think it's true. And it's really close to what not to do, what you just said, but it's a rephrasing of it and you'll usually have multiple rounds. You might meet like with, 2 sets of 2 people, and each time you can ask this, but when you get a chance to ask your question, you can ask, and it's rare to hear anyone ask this, but is there any, especially if you're a rambler like me, Martin, I feel you on that one. Are there any red or yellow flags that I can address for you? And it's just a much better question, because usually, any interview is thinking about, okay, what are the things that I think are possible concerns? And it gives you one chance to address those, because in a lot of times it's inaccurate, and it's your chance to clarify.
Yeah. Just jumping over to chat, and I like that Martin kind of put this last one in chat. Is there anything that you were hoping to cover that we didn't get to? I've also heard other career coaches recommend, like, ask them at the end, like, do you have any concerns about me, like, moving forward? But that one can be a little bit tricky because they don't always have a good idea yet. I mean, it's a team decision whether you're going to get hired. It never comes down to just one person. Unless it's like an itty bitty startup and you're only talking to like the CTO, which is just their lead dev at that point. But yeah, I kind of waffle back and forth on whether to even ask that question, because it's not a good indicator, or they may not have enough data yet to know, are you going to move forward in the interview? But kind of going back to what Martin was saying, it kind of shows this insecurity on your side of did I do okay? Am I good enough? And I tell people, when you're working on a code challenge and you're coming up with, like, this is the design of what I want to go code, does this look okay to you? Instead, phrase it as, what do you think about this approach? Because then it doesn't show that insecurity. I do want to go over to chat, though, because we had some really good questions kind of coming up here. So GothDev mentioned in techinterview.guide, I write, a lot of different things, and I've got a point in there about, I like to ask the same question to both engineering peers as well as the managers, and kind of see, like, how well do those questions line up? Like, if Emmanuel was an engineer at the same company where Brett is the manager, I might ask both of them, like, how well does management talk to the team? And then see how well do those questions line up. Because if Emmanuel's like, Brett never talks to us, and Brett's like, I talk to the team all the time, then there's definitely a disconnect where the management thinks that they're doing something, but the boots on the ground, they're like, nah, not so much. Or how does the team plan the effort, or who's in charge of, like, planning what the team does, and kind of getting a sense of how well those things play together. Jay Vane also mentioned they're on their third and last interview for a position at a small private company. I was wondering, what would be some of the questions you'd ask to get a sense of where the company is in growth scale, like funding or growth? Revenue figures or other growth indicators are private and a little sensitive. Yeah, I agree. It can be a little tricky to ask those kinds of questions. There are some resources out there that I use to look at funding, because even private companies, they may like anytime a startup raises millions of dollars, they put out like full press release, like, look at us, we raised some money. And there are companies out there that just collect all that data, and they'll like send you newsletters every day of like who raised funding and so on. But let's go over to Emmanuel and Brett, like from a management side of things. How would you expect someone to ask that kind of question, or would you even expect someone to ask a question about like financial stability of the company, especially in like the earlier stages of startup land or early growth? Let's start with Brett and go to Emmanuel.
Yeah, I would ask those questions, so I would expect others to, and I think it becomes more important the further down your career you get to ask those questions. But I think it's fair to ask. It's hard to ask what's your revenue, but it is fair to ask, is your revenue growing? Are you profitable? I think that's absolutely a fair question. Do you have a plan to get to profitability? Are you venture backed or private equity backed? Can you tell me a little bit about your runway? And those types of questions they're important for you to know. Is this a stable job? Right. If that's important to you. Sometimes you don't care. You're looking to join something chaotic and help build something from value, and you're okay with that. But a lot of times stability is important too. And I think it's hard to get a sense if you don't ask those type of questions.
Yeah, and going back to what Goth Dev was asking, like I mentioned in Tech Interview Guide, like there are different kinds of questions that you would ask to engineers, and then there are questions that you would ask to managers. And that, the case that they brought up in chat is something that I would ask both. This kind of question about revenue and runway and things, you wouldn't really ask that of a peer engineer. You would ask that of a manager, director kind of level, as opposed to someone that you would just be working with day to day, because they may not even know. They may have some idea, but it may not be like super clear to them. Emmanuel, any thoughts on asking that kind of question?
Yeah, like other people said, I would. The advice I would give to someone who's interviewing is do your homework a little bit. Look for any press releases for the last time they had announced revenue, and keep that, like, make note of that. And then if it's been more than a year, 2 years, or 3 years before they haven't had a new round of revenue in a while, uh, I would ask, like, it looks like you guys, like, how are you guys doing financially? I would say, like, ask something like, I see that you haven't had a new round in 2 or 3 years. You guys must be, almost kind of jokingly, like, you guys must be killing it with revenue or something, as far as profitability or something, and see what they say about that. It doesn't. I sometimes wonder if it can come off a little too, like, I've seen um, interview rounds where, when someone was asking about how the company is doing, at very small startups, sometimes they look at that person and say, like, oh, I don't think this person might be the right fit because they might be too concerned or too risk averse. And so also realize the risk profile of whether you're going for a very small, Series A, B, or C, like very small startup, versus a place that's more established, and how much money they have in the bank. How One way of figuring this out without talking about money at all is to ask how many open requisitions, like how many open positions they have, how many people are they, like, adding to the team, like, and overall for the company, what's it like, which growth phase are they in? Do they feel like they're still growing? And those are sort of clues about that. If you're concerned with it, but you don't want to explicitly ask anything about revenue. Um, but yeah, I would say it's important to I think it's more important to understand your own profile when it comes to how do you want to work in some place that is kind of chaotic and risky, versus do you want to work someplace that is, you know, very well funded and everything's kind of very comfortable. Um, I will say, though, that the funnest places to work for are the small places that are doing really well, like profit basically kind of shields all other problems, and, like, once the company is making money, everything is puts everything under this big rug of profit, of success, of growth, of, and it's one of those kind of very unique. Everyone should do it when they're young. I think, like, in their 20s, just go for that wild ride on a rocket ship startup. But yeah, the ways to ask about the information are, are they still are they hiring right now? Because if they ran out of money, they wouldn't be hiring many positions other than yours. And then ask them, like, given this round of funding, how, like, how's your profitability like? What's your runway like? But there's ways around it. But if you don't want to ask directly about the money.
Let's go to Lex for this one, and then Martin. Kind of piggybacking off a little bit of what just Emmanuel was just talking about when it comes to things like work-life balance. I mean, we talk about that a lot, and I've worked with people that are like, oh, that phrase is garbage because there's no such thing. It's life, But it's like, well, you do need to have, like, a good balance. Like, how do you coach people around asking that kind of question? Like, am I going to be working 90 hours a week, or am I working 40 hours a week? Am I working like a 4-day work week? Like, 4 days, 10 hours, or am I like, working the traditional 9 to 5, Monday to Friday kind of thing? Like, how do you coach people to ask about those kinds of like work-life balance types of questions? Let's start with Lex.
Sure. So when I coach people around this question, the first thing we need to figure out is like what balance looks like to you. So similar to you said, the balance looks different for different people. I've worked with moms who are trying to do a full-time job and also make time for kids. So like your time that you have for life is going to look different than someone else versus someone who like wants to spend more time doing the work. So figuring out what your balance looks like is the first step to this. I think you can ask questions similar to like exploring PTO. So there's like, I think it's not a newer thing, but it's very flashy to have like unlimited PTO. But the trick is that no one actually uses it, right? So I think asking questions about like, what does the workload look like when folks take time off? How does your staff support one another? I think it's kind of a broader question, but kind of digging into what the workload looks like if you're working with a team of people. Asking questions like that. I also like to ask, so not like, what do you do outside of work, but how do you spend your free time? Like, what does your free time look like? And if they draw a blank, I think that's kind of telling, right? Like if there's kind of this far off look in their eyes of like, free time, don't know what that's like. You can kind of get a sense from them what their time looks like. I also ask questions around self-care. So like, how do you take time, care for yourself? And those sorts of questions can be telling. They're not always like fully centered around work-life balance, but I think they're kind of connected in those ways.
Yeah, that's good. I like to ask other engineers, like, when was the last time you had to like, get a call in the middle of the night to fix something? Like that's a pretty telling one too. And then from an engineering manager perspective, I would ask them the same question and then see like, is the manager actually like on board? Like, are they saying the same thing that the actual like folks on the team are saying? Because that can be really telling as well about like, is management really aware of what's going on the team and things like that. So Martin, any follow-up on that?
I second everything that y'all are saying, and it is one of those things where, again, I think it's time and place. I always tend to find those questions work best when networking, and this is why it's so important to network while you're applying for jobs, because the best networking experience I ever had was when I got coffee with someone who, me getting an interview informed them that they were getting laid off. And I was like, hey, I'm interviewing tomorrow. I think we might work together. And they were like, what? And then we got coffee and I found out they were getting laid off. And so we ended up becoming really good friends. And they told me everything about the work-life balance and everything I needed to know about that job. And it's just one of those things where I'm like, I just happened to be at an event with that person, and it that worked out. But I find that in the actual interviews, I think we try and do too much sometimes. We try and answer all of our questions in these interviews, and we try to be impressive and answer our questions, show our values, and find out all the details of the job. And I just feel like for people who are already anxious, already like overwhelmed, already not good at communicating, trying to like jam all this into the interview is going to just mess you up sometimes. So most of the people I'm working with are making big career changes, and they're like really insecure. So trying to get them to ask questions about work-life balance in a way that isn't going to come off as like odd or like negative tends not to work. So I always say, like, network with people at the company and ask them, because it's out of the context of the job interview. So you'll get realer answers. And then also try to maybe wait till you get the offer. And then once you get the offer, you now have a bit of clout and power, and you can say like, all right, thanks for this offer. I have a few questions. Can we increase the baseline salary to this number? What do the hours look like during the week? When do you expect me to be in the office? What is the work from home stipend like for setting up my desk? Do you have an education stipend? That's when you can ask all those questions without worry, because you've already gotten the offer. So a big thing that I try and coach people on is try to get every offer. And then once you have the offer, you can be like, why would I want this offer? This is a ridiculous offer. But like the goal here is to be someone who can get offers, right? Whereas I find people go into like their first interview and they hear something that's like, well, I don't know if that's the job I want. And I'm like, wait a second, you haven't even gotten to the second interview. Like, don't judge them until like you're winning. Like, once you're winning, once people want to go on the second interview with you, the second date with you, or whatever analogy you want to derive, then we can start being picky, right? And so like when I'm coaching someone and they're just trying to get their foot into an industry and they're like, well, what if they don't pay me the extra 5K that I want? What if they don't give me the hours that I want? And I go, do you want to break into the industry or not? Like, where are you at? Like, what do you need to do here? So that's a big thing where I'm working with so many career transition people that like they're already spending all of their time stressing out about the job search. So I'm like, what's the difference? You might as well spend that time getting paid. So anyway, that's maybe a little bit too glib, but
No,
yeah.
Cool. Yeah, those are good answers. So Brett, let's talk about unlimited PTO. I mean, in engineering management, I mean, sometimes we see that as like, oh, we'll just put that as a perk. In your mind, what does unlimited PTO mean? And like, what kinds of questions have you been asked about that kind of thing? Or what kinds of questions would you expect to answer about something like unlimited PTO?
You know, unlimited PTO, it's interesting because my perspective of that has changed. I loved it when I first, when I got an engineering job at way back at Return Path, and I'm like, ooh, unlimited PTO, that sounds great. And then you realize how hard it is to take the PTO. But my story is recently at SignPost, we have some historical offer letter documents, and in there it talks about PTO, and it's like, we have unlimited PTO at SignPost, and it said things like you can't take a vacation in your first 90 days. I'm like, yeah, you can. You just got to tell me about it, communicate as early as often. Sure. So please, HR, get rid of that. And then it's like, but we try to average 3 weeks a year. And I'm like, no, get rid of that. Like, take as much as you need, but be respectful to your team. It's not about what the manager needs or the company. It's about you're most likely going to end up on a team somewhere, and it's about being respectful for the team. So that means if you're respectful for the team, you likely can't just take 2 weeks off starting tomorrow with no notice and you haven't communicated to your team, because you're going to end up dropping work that they need to pick up for you. So that's to me what unlimited PTO is. And I think good companies that do it well, they're not managing the amount of time that you're taking to see that you're abusing it. They're managing that you are actually utilizing it and taking it enough time. You know, good companies that do good PTO.
I wish more companies did.
Yeah, or at least like take a week a quarter. And if you're not doing that, managers, make sure your teams, your team members are at least hitting that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I've certainly been at companies where it's like, oh yeah, unlimited PTO, but like we're not going to track it. So if you don't take it, we don't know. But if you don't take it, you're burning out, and we don't know. I saw a quote. I think it was on, I forget if it was LinkedIn or Twitter. Just like within the last couple of days, I think it was on Twitter. They were talking about taking PTO, and they're like, it's better to take PTO before you need the PTO to recover. Like, it's easier to take the PTO to sort of like maintain that good state of mind and your physical health than to have to take PTO to recover from something because you've, overworked and, you're overtired, and now you're spending your time off just recovering from that just to go back to the job and start it all over again. So like use it as a preventative measure as opposed to like a reactive kind of thing. Sorry, Emmanuel, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, my career as a manager, I've had more trouble with people not taking enough time off than taking too much. It's very rare. Like, there was one person who would just take every Friday off, and that was their PTO. But most of the time has been people who, like you said, don't take enough time off, or they feel intimidated by the process of just asking. And as a manager, as long as, like, so many things I think would be better if people like try to realize what the manager's perspective is. And I would say my own performance as an individual became better once I had to manage people. The best advice that I could give someone is that if you already have a job now, and you want to get better at interviewing, join the interview team and watch be on the other side of that and watch people coming in and interviewing, like the patterns that you see of people kind of performing poorly, being really overly nervous, being so scared to say the wrong thing, they just keep saying the same generic thing over and over and over again. And but to the point of PTO, most people either don't take enough time, and you could see them getting burnt out. And I have to remind my the people on my team to, like, you need to go take this time off, right? When are you going to take some time off this quarter? Like, you know, and then the other part of it is that because you have unlimited, sometimes people treat it very casually, so that you learn about, like, oh, hey, yeah, next week I'm going to take the week off. And it's like, sometimes it's not even 3 or 4 days notice. And you're like, okay, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news here, but you're like putting me in a bad situation of like trying to figure out how to balance it. And the other thing that I would say is that managers think about someone's performance over a quarter. They don't think about, like, like when you're an individual contributor, sometimes you feel very like, okay, did I do bad on this one function or this one? Right? No, they're thinking about the entire project. How did it do over the course of months? How did it impact for the entire organization? That kind of, and because of that, with PTO, we're thinking broader. Like, is this person in the right headspace? Are they getting, do they have enough time off? Are they getting too stressed out? Are they taking care of themselves? And just give us, and are they leaving their team in the lurch? Because that's the worst thing that you can do with PTO is something you're not there for, and the ball gets dropped, and then all of a sudden people are trying to contact you when you're on vacation. And like those are the kinds of hardest things to deal with as a manager. But if you, especially if you told me ahead of time, and you're like, okay, if you're a planner, it's much easier for us to like get you your time off. And please take the 2 weeks, take 3 weeks if you really need it, and you want to go somewhere, and as long as you're not taking 3 weeks, 5 times a year or something, right? Like it should be fine, right? But
Yeah.
that's been so rare of ever having to have that conversation. More often is like, man, you haven't taken not even a day off other than a sick day in 6 months. Like, can we please talk about, kindly think about maybe taking some time off and recharging your batteries. It'll be good for you.
Yeah, that's good. Cool. Let's start to wind down a little bit. I'm going to drop a link in the chat here. So there's a website called keyvalues.com, and they've got an interesting page on here called their culture queries. And what they've got on here is they've got sort of a way that you can go in and you can kind of pick and choose, like, this is important to me about a company, this is important to me about a company. And it actually kind of auto-generates questions to ask. Have any of you seen this kind of site? Like, what are your thoughts or feelings about, sites like this to, like, we talked about, like, don't go find, like, the top 50 list of questions because everybody's asking those questions. But, like, what do you think about sites like Key Values? Let's start with Lex. What do you think?
That's really funny. Someone actually just shared this in one of the Turing Slacks today, so I just saw this like moments before hopping on this. This is certainly interesting. I think my initial worry in looking at something like this is that people could maybe take this as like a script instead of like a jumping off point. So I think that I just clicked on work-life balance as an option since we had talked about that. I'm looking at some of these options. I think some of these are good ideas, but my initial worry is the like preface that these things need to be tailored or kind of changed to what you would actually ask, as opposed to kind of like copying and pasting them into the end of an interview. But the questions look good. I'm excited that this exists.
Yeah, I think that's good. Like, you still have to make it your own. Like, it has to feel conversational, and you need to stand out. You need to be memorable for these kinds of things. So certainly use this kind of thing as a template, but like, don't just sit there and read, like, how do you decide what projects people work on, how much say to engine, like, you don't want to just read these things off. I actually had, so Brett and Emmanuel, have you ever heard of, what's it called? Like the 12-factor app or whatever. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, the 12-factor application.
Yeah, so
It's like
I remember I
the
did an interview at SendGrid where someone came in and they're like, do you follow a 12 factor? I'm like, well, we're getting there. And he's like, okay, well, I'm just gonna go ahead and read like all of these, 12 things. Do you do this? Do you do this? Do you do this? And I'm like, dude, what a waste of time.
I
Like,
actually remember you talking about that
You remember
back
that?
in the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. That
and
was.
it's like, like I get why you're asking, because they're important from an engineering principle. Like, how do you plan things out? Do you follow Agile? Do you use like a Git repository and things like that? But you don't want it to be so methodical. Like, it's got to be memorable and so on. Martin, are there like pre-made like lists of questions that you tell people like, hey, go draw inspiration from these, but don't just ask these? Like, how do you sort of coach people to come up with their questions?
So yeah, I've actually like gone through lists with people and been like, this question's garbage. Why do you think it's garbage? Like, be like critical with the way you look at these things. At the same time, when I started my career, my anxiety was so bad that I would literally like have panic attacks and freeze mid conversation with people if I didn't know what to say, or if I like would make a false step. So like, part of my advice is also read the scripts verbatim until you can finally get off script. Like, it takes time sometimes to develop, to like, there's almost like these phases. It's like, use the resources because they're not going to like damage anything necessarily. It's better than saying nothing. So use them, have them on a piece of paper so that you have like a crutch. And like, you might bomb a couple interviews, but that's okay, because then the first thing you have to do is like desensitize your nervous system to interviewing. And then once you're desensitized to the anxieties, then you can start going, all right, well, how do I rephrase this question? And then once you can rephrase the question, then you, and of course, obviously, if you're at home and you have the questions in front of you and you read it and you realize this, where is this going to go? If it's a yes or no question, don't ask it. Ask open-ended, opinion-based questions. Like, definitely do that kind of stuff. But I don't know, I encourage people to use scripts until they don't need scripts, but also push yourself to get off script as well. And one of my favorite things to do is to really ask questions, like opinion-based questions that get people talking. So my best interview, I like, still from when I was an undergrad, I had a broken thumb and I went into an interview and went to shake the guy's hand. And he's like, what happened to your hand? And I was just so nervous. I was like, because I like tried to shake his hand with a cast on. And he's like, what happened to your hand? I said, well, I went skiing and I broke my thumb. And he goes, I love skiing. And I was like, where do you ski? And the rest of the interview was just him talking about skiing. And in the last 5 to 10 minutes, he goes, we should probably talk about like marketing stuff. Like, you're in marketing classes, right? And I was like, yeah. He's like, that's good enough for me. All right. Yes. And like, that's one of the only people that I stayed in touch with, like,
best
from
interviews
that
ever.
job for years. Exactly. So like, getting other people talking about things takes the pressure off of you. And I love what you were saying earlier. It's like, think about their perspective, right? If you were to ask this question, how would they answer it? Go to that next step. Like, how would they actually answer this question? Like, try to answer it. Because if you say like, what's the culture like here? Well, how are they going to answer that? They're going to say, it's great.
Yeah,
we all love each other.
Way too broad. Yeah.
Right? Or do you enjoy working here? How could they legitimately answer that question? Like, they can't. They're going to say, yes, I enjoy working here. So like, really just put it through the Q&A and you'll see what's a good question, what's a bad question pretty quick. Yeah. Or try it out in a real interview and see how it fails and scratch it off your
improve for next time. Lex, I like what you wrote, what you dropped in chat. It's like, sometimes it's helpful to have those things as a guide until you have the skill of building those questions yourself. So yeah, fake it till you make it, right? Like, just ask those questions. If you have nothing else, ask those questions. Use those guides. That's why they're published. That's why they're out there, and there's lots of them. But like, try to find, like, what I would suggest doing is like, go find like all of those, well, not all of them, but like maybe 3 or 4 of them. Go find all the common questions and don't ask those. Like, find the questions that are like, oh, that question's not on any other list, I'm gonna ask that one. Because then it comes across like, oh, that's a more unique question than like, oh yeah, everybody's asking like, what's the culture like? Or, you don't want to be memorable for not being memorable, for sure. What do you like about your job? Yeah, that's a broad question for sure. Cool. Brett and Emmanuel. Let's start with Brett. So just to kind of wrap things up, like, what's the worst question you were ever asked at an interview? Like the worst thing that, you said you got any questions and they like asked something and you're like, oh, cringiest question you were ever asked.
A host of illegal things spring to mind.
Oh no.
From both sides of the table. The absolute worst was an interviewer asking me about how like they had moved to Los Angeles for this position, and they were talking about how to pick up women in Los Angeles and how that differed from where he was from. And I was just, but you're in this weird position where you like, I just want this job. So you just like keep going along or whatever. But but for the interviewee, the worst question. It's the people that like assume they already have the job. That's always kind of a weird turnoff. There's ways to like exude confidence, and there's ways to exude complete and utter arrogance. And there's a fine line between the two of them. But most people will never get to cross that line. But like just assuming like, oh, okay, yeah. So I guess in the next interview we'll talk about salary, or I guess in the next time, it sort of takes the wind out of the sails, because when you're interviewing and you want to give them that you want to shake their hand and say like, hey, like we're really confident, but we'll never actually say in that round of the interview whether they have it, because it has to be a group decision, and it belies a sort of ignorance of how the whole thing kind of works.
Yeah. Cool. Brett, bring us home. What's on your mind around this?
I've been lucky. I don't think I've ever had any, at least that I can recall, any like bigoted or racist or sexist questions. But sometimes you get, it's when you state your opinion with your question that leads to a cringeworthy moment, like how do you secure your production environment, because I don't think junior engineers should ever have production access. And it's like, what, you didn't need to state your opinion with the second one, because I don't probably agree with you philosophically. So you don't necessarily, you shouldn't give your motive behind asking that question. In some of those, like if it's important to you, like you've had a bad experience, you've trained junior engineers too much or something like that, if you're more senior, and sometimes you wear that bad experience on your sleeve, and you're like, you'll ask questions like, do you expect me to train other engineers? Questions like that are really some of the bad ones. I also think, coming back to what you said about asking, two others that stand out is one, when you ask me what questions I should ask, I've had that a few times. That's not the greatest question.
You actually had a candidate ask you what they should ask you?
Yes, two or three times that's happened. And then the other one that's always bad that you get a lot of is, and a lot of times, you'll do engineers first, and sometimes you'll do managers second. So a lot of times these days, I'm the last round of interviewing. So I get a lot of, well, I've already asked all the questions that I wanted for everybody else. Repeat your questions. And to everyone, you already hinted on why you should, because you want to know, is the management experience different than developer? But ask it over and over again. It's okay. That we're not going to trade notes and say, hey, they asked all of us the same. We are going to trade notes, but we're not going to say, hey, they asked all of us the same question. That's bad. We're going to say, oh, that's good. How'd you answer it?
They're being thorough, right?
We're gonna ask each other how, that was an interesting question. How did we answer that? So
cool. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. I like to end my guest series by asking like really fun and weird rapid fire questions. So I'm just going to go kind of clockwise around the interface and ask. So we're going to start with Lex. If a movie was made about your life, what genre would it be, and who would play you as an actor?
Gut reaction, a Wes Anderson movie. I know that's not a genre, but I feel like that's what I exude. And it would have to be Zendaya, because she's my like real life doppelganger.
Nice. Martin, one thing that annoys you the most?
Lines.
Lines?
Standing in lines.
Okay. Oh, standing in lines. All right. Queues for those in the UK.
Yes.
Let's see. Brett, strangest thing you've ever eaten?
Oh gosh.
Come on, rapid fire.
I don't know.
Rapid fire.
I don't know. Menudo.
All right. Emmanuel, what's one thing you own you wish you didn't?
Oh. So many things, but I have this big 4x4. I bought it during COVID. It has gets 10 miles to the gallon. It was a lot of fun to go off road for like 4 or 5 times, but
5 minutes.
yeah, it is. It's more annoying than it is fun at this point.
Yep. Lex, speaking of annoying, most annoying celebrity.
Oh, there's so many to name. Any of the Kardashians, I think.
All right, Martin. Least favorite beverage.
Ooh. Well, I don't drink, so let's go with a Red Bull and vodka.
All right. Brett, favorite book growing up?
Where the Red Fern Grows.
Ooh, that's a good one. Mine was Goodnight Moon. And when we started having kids, that was like the first book I bought to read to them.
Yeah.
So. Let's see. Emmanuel, what's one food you wouldn't want to give up?
Mandazis. It's a Kenyan dish that my mom makes.
Sweet.
The best memories I have of her on Sunday mornings, getting up early to make them for our church group. And so you would like wake up to the smell of these like fried dough balls that are kind of like donuts, but
Nice.
without sugar. They're great with tea.
Awesome. Great. Well, cool. Appreciate all of you very much for spending time and kind of like talking out this whole thing, like what kinds of questions, how do we form those questions, what makes a good question, what makes a bad question, how do we practice these things, how do we refine them over time. Again, we're going to go clockwise. Tell folks how they can connect with you. Feel free to drop your links in chat for like LinkedIn or Twitch, things like that. Lex, tell us what you got going on.
Sure. I stream sometimes on Twitch. I'm at Lex Survive. I'm at Lexcetera on pretty much all other social media. I really like puns. So I'll drop those in chat.
Awesome. Great. Martin, what do you got?
You can hit me up at careertherapy.com. I had to retype the link a second time. But you can also find all of my podcast stuff on iTunes or Spotify or Google, wherever you listen to that kind of stuff. YouTube as well at Career Therapy. Career Therapy Podcast. That's and then find me on LinkedIn, Martin McGovern. That's where I spend way too much of my time.
Awesome. Thanks, Martin. Brett, how can folks find you, keep in contact with you? Got anything else going on?
Yeah, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. It's easy to find. There's not many Dangerfields out there. So Brett Dangerfield on LinkedIn. SignPost.com/careers. We're like every tech company right now. We're hiring. And lastly, I'm in a number of tech Slacks if you're in the Denver area, Denver devs. If you're interested in engineering leadership, the RANDS Leadership Slack group is another one. I'll post those links. You can find me in them, and I'm happy to chat anytime.
Awesome. Thanks, Brett. It was good to have you on the stream tonight. And Emmanuel.
You can find me on LinkedIn under Emmanuel Mwangi. Here at Tinder, we are hiring, and we are especially looking for a QA backend software engineering test for help us release Tinder to millions of people, and we are doing continuous integration, continuous deployment, and releasing multiple times a day to tens of millions of people. So, yeah.
Sweet. Just one of the many things on the 12-factor app list of questions to ask. Cool. Appreciate having you on the stream as well. It's good to kind of reconnect with you this summer for sure. It's been a minute since we chatted. We're also hiring at Stream. I dropped that link in chat as well. I'm going to get all these links together and I'm going to put them on the YouTube description for those folks. I got everything going on at techinterview.guide. I've got a daily email series. I do the streaming here Thursdays and Sundays. The whole archive of all these videos is going to go up on YouTube, so check out YouTube. I've got all the Q&A sessions all split up into videos, and those are releasing every day through September and into I think all the way through into November now, kind of staggering out those days as well. But appreciate everybody hanging out. Appreciate everybody chatting as well. So thanks for the questions in chat. Appreciate everybody hanging out. All of you, thank you so much. Lex, Martin, Brett, Emmanuel. It was great having you on here just to hear your perspectives. I love having perspectives on the stream. I just don't want to be like just my voice, spouting on the internet. I love having other people bring their perspectives and thoughts. Thank you so much for sharing that with us tonight. And we'll wrap up here. We'll get this on YouTube later on. And have a good night, everyone. We'll see you on Sunday. Cheers.
See you guys.